Director of Science is Us, and I want to thank you all for joining us today for this webinar entitled Dual Disaster Threats, COVID-19 and Florida's Hurricane Season. Science is Us is a foundation-supported effort that brings together 10 science and engineering organizations to help improve the policy environment for science and engineering broadly. We support we advocate for increased support for research and also for increased use of science in the policymaking process. And we've organized this webinar today in collaboration with our partners at the American Flood Coalition. The American Flood Coalition is also a national nonprofit group and they advocate for solutions to flooding and sea level rise. We all know that we're experiencing very challenging times across our country right now. COVID-19 certainly has changed the way we interact with each other, impacting every aspect of our lives, local businesses and schools as well. And then, of course, for those of us in Florida, we know that this is our usual hurricane season, and I believe Hurricane Delta is moving up the coast as we speak after making landfall a couple of days ago in Louisiana. So this is a highly topical time, and we wanted to take today to provide some information and opportunities for communities throughout Florida and businesses in the state to give you the necessary tools to safeguard against not just hurricanes, but dealing with the added threat of the COVID-19 pandemic at the same time. We've got a number of really great speakers joining us today, and we're going to highlight a number of resources and strategies that folks can use to plan for future scenarios. It's my great privilege to introduce to you Kevin Guthrie. Kevin's career includes over 28 years in public safety management. He currently serves as Deputy Director for the Florida Division of Emergency Management and leads many of the state's efforts to address and mitigate the impact of hurricanes and of COVID-19. And so I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today, Deputy Director Guthrie, and the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you very much, Rachel. Can you hear me all right? All right, very good. So as to the topic of discussion, co-response planning in the COVID world. So obviously with your associations and the individuals that you have watching this, I'm not going to really go a whole lot into the hurricane flood mitigation, or I shouldn't say flood mitigation, flood response side. I'm going to talk much more about the COVID side and talk to you a little bit about best practice on what we've been doing here in the state of Florida. So first of all, anytime we try to send people to a disaster, we try to send them in COVID clean in, COVID clean out. So, the idea of testing people going into disaster areas and test them coming out is one of the things that we've been doing quite a bit of here lately. Another thing that we have done in our actual planning scenarios is we actually have two planning cells. We have the hurricane planning cell who is handling everything that's hurricane related. There starts to be a little crossover in the planning area of sheltering because there is obviously a COVID environment that you have to consider when you go into sheltering. And then we have the side that is just absolutely nothing but COVID. So hurricane, COVID in the middle, they meet through sheltering. So we do have rapid tests now. If we do end up getting another storm, as you just mentioned, Hurricane Delta is going up into the, I think in Mississippi Valley right now. But had that been here, we would have had about 300,000 tests that we could have pulled very quickly and got out to shelters to do some shelter testing. We did do that with Hurricane Sally. We did have some of the rapid COVID-19 testing that we did, and we tested a couple of hundred people that went to sheltering there. Again, Sally being a Cat 1 hurricane, only clipping the very far western panhandle of the state of Florida. We only ended up having to test a few hundred people. But making sure that you can test people, again, try to get, if you can get a clean environment in, a clean environment out, that's really what we've been focusing on this this last year, both with responders as well as individuals that are in the testing environment. I think as I come back to the plan again, is we want to make sure that you're planning for that environment. You know, what does it mean to be a Floridian in hurricane season with COVID? Well, go to that shelter. Again, if you talk about your readiness response plan at the individual level, and you're going to have to seek a shelter, you're going to have to evacuate anywhere, you know, even if you have the means necessary to stay at a hotel, go to somebody else's house, whatever that might be. How does your hurricane supply kit changed? Well, you know, do you have masks? You know, you need to make sure your kit contains a mask. It needs to contain hand sanitizer. Depending on the environment you're in, it may need to have a face shield or gloves, goggles. Again, depending on what you do in a disaster, you know, if you're a first responder, then you may need to put gowns, isolation gowns in your preparedness kit. So those are just a few things on the personal preparedness level that you need to be aware of. As well as everything else that needs to go into your kit, you know, your important documents, prescriptions, medications, making sure that you have contact names and numbers. All of those things are things that you would still continue to put inside your kit, your personal preparedness kit. I think some of your membership and association members may look at it, preparedness on a business level. So what's happened and changed at the business level? Again, common touch point areas that you may have to do within your business if you're opening up your business or you're conducting business in a disaster or in a COVID-19 environment, especially now that we're back to phase 3, is what are the things that you are looking at, such as, again, are you going to require masks inside your business? If you are, do you have those masks able to give out? Again, what is your hand sanitizer situation look like for people doing business with your business? We and the EOC behind me, you don't see it right there, but you may see a young woman going around just cleaning things. We have somebody go around and clean the common touch points every hour in our EOC. So that's actually something we contracted out. So again, trying to make sure you're providing for your customers, providing for the individuals that may come into your business, and provide them a very safe environment so that it is, you know, as free as possible from COVID. There's a couple other things that, you know, I would say that we've certainly learned. We do a lot of air scrubbing here at the state EOC as well as other places, state buildings. We utilize decontamination units, metabios, hydrogen peroxide based decontamination units that we can put into a room. Enclave systems, again, negative pressure systems. Those are all things that, depending on your situation, I know that not every item applies to every individual situation, but those are just some of the things that we have put into the planning process here at the division, as well as state buildings and other buildings throughout. So that's kind of a high level. I am a little bit pressed for time today, but I want to make sure I leave enough time to take any questions or any topics that you and your association may want me to address. I'm sorry, Rachel, I can't hear you.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Double mute. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to go put some masks in my hurricane evacuation kit because I had not done that to this point. And even here on the First Coast, we do occasionally get a storm. Do we have any questions for the director? You can enter them into the Q&A function. Okay, we don't see any immediate questions, and since we know your time is tight, we want to thank you very much for joining us today. I will shift gears and hand things over to Tanya Wilson and our panel of experts. Tanya is going to moderate that panel. She has an extensive career in community development and planning in South Florida. She currently works for the city of North Miami as the Planning, Zoning, and Development Director. And I will hand it over to you now, Tanya, and you can introduce the panelists.
All right, thank you, Rachel. I hope you can all hear me. Would like to thank everyone for attending today's dual disaster threats, COVID and Florida's hurricane season. If ever we could think of a year that has had unprecedented happenings with its fair share of man-made and natural disasters, this would be the year. But despite the current threats of COVID-19 and its disruptive impact to human health and our economy, we do recognize that we are not completely out the woods. There are still additional threats looming from an overly active hurricane season, impending heavy rain events that are up ahead, and we know that there are going to be associated flooding issues with that. But there are millions of Americans that are at risk of loss of life, damage to property. Certainly, we have seen that with dual disasters, lack of planning and lack of preparation can exacerbate that. So those are the greatest risks are the communities that we know are experiencing several vulnerabilities, ranging from food insecurities, health disparities, high unemployment, inadequate housing, and climate gentrification. So we do believe that it's incumbent on our leaders at the local, state, and federal levels to plan and prepare robust dual disaster strategies to minimize the adverse impacts to human health and our economy and the environment. So we have a very impressive panel today that will be joining us to help unpack some of these very complex issues. So I'm going to introduce our two panelists that are here, starting with Amanda. Amanda Kobokovich is a senior analyst at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security and a research associate at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She has worked with the World Health Organization, the novel coronavirus 19 mass gatherings expert group, to support the development of the mass gathering indicator for the World Health Organization COVID-19 strategic preparedness and response monitoring and evaluation framework. Her expertise includes global health security, laboratory system strengthening, biotechnology, and pandemic preparedness. In May 2020, Amanda and her colleagues released a toolkit for businesses considering reopening and expanding operations of COVID-19. Let's welcome Amanda. We also have Melissa Roberts. She is the founder and executive director of the American Flood Coalition, where she supports coalition membership, leads policy development, and guides strategy for the coalition's mission of advocating for national solutions to flooding and sea level rise. Under Melissa's leadership, the American Flood Coalition has grown to over 230 members. Prior to her current role, Melissa was an engagement manager at McKinsey & Company, where she specialized in infrastructure finance and planning, working with national governments, cities, major foundations, private sector investors, and developers. In May, the American Flood Coalition released a dual disaster guide exploring flood disasters in the age of COVID-19. Welcome, Melissa. So we have a very interesting combination of women that I would say probably have more than together over 30 years of experience, if I'm doing the math quickly. So certainly I think we're in store for a very informative discussion. Amanda, let's begin with you. Can you give us a baseline regarding the current public health crisis? You are muted, Amanda.
There we go. Is that better?
That's perfect. Go ahead.
Okay. I have a few slides I can show you because I'm personally a visual learner. So let me just share my screen here. Oh, no, come back, Zoom. There we go. Share screen. Okay. So pull my notes. Or maybe they won't pull up. That's good. All right. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen that the U.S. has had the most cases overall, the most deaths overall for all countries. Right now, U.S. and India are kind of going back and forth with reported new cases. But it's not just an exception that we are experiencing more cases. Most states in the U.S., as well as many European countries, are trending upward as they happened for the last 2 weeks. However, we're getting better at treating the disease. So ventilators are in good supply. We have a better understanding of what drugs to use and understanding what patients may need those drugs more. So there's been a decrease in the mortality rate, even if we haven't necessarily seen a corresponding decrease in cases. So there are several vaccine candidates, many of which are promising, but it will still take several months for a successful candidate to be approved and then manufactured and rolled out. But what we can see is that public health measures are working. The masks, hand hygiene, physical distancing are all starting to, all have made a difference. But I think we can attribute part of the rise in cases to COVID fatigue, which is everyone's just tired of it. We're 9 months in now, and it's been a long time. So that's definitely a contributing factor. So here's the US from sort of a bird's eye view, and you can see, let me see if I get my mouse over here. You can see where we started to shut down in April and May, and then we sort of got control of it. And then as places started to reopen, we went way back before, we went way higher than we did initially. And we have yet to come down around here to bring it fully under control. So we're sort of hovering around here, trying to get things back together. And that sort of segs into the county level risk. So as you can see, the risk of transmission here on this map is from the Brown University School of Public Health. Red indicates that it's relatively unchecked community spread. So at the beginning of the pandemic, you would have seen lots of red up in the Northeast in New York City, a lot over in California and Washington State where it first started. And then in the summer months, it sort of moved down into the Southern United States. And now we're seeing it more move into the Midwestern states. So there's still a long way to go before we get our pandemic under control. And then would you like me to go into the toolkit now or stop for questions?
Okay, we're going to switch to Melissa. Thank you for that, just giving us some context in terms of the baseline. So Melissa, I understand that American Flood Coalition recently put out a dual disaster handbook. I've actually gone through the handbook, very impressed. It takes you through some very practical steps, I think, that as a local government, we can certainly apply in the short run. So highlight for our audience the dilemma communities face today and key considerations for responding to flood events and other disasters during a pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will also just share a slide to give everyone something to look at. So just thinking about kind of the question that you've teed up, which I'm really grateful for the chance to talk about. As we're seeing, Amanda did a great job kind of giving us an overview of what we're seeing with COVID-19. And I think what we've really focused on as the American Flood Coalition is how this interacts with what we do, which is really this focus on increasing flooding in all forms. So stronger storms, higher seas, and more frequent flooding. And said, what happens to all of our communities on the front lines when you see these interact? You see, a stronger hurricane season, you see sunny day flooding, along with this novel pandemic situation that we've never had to do before. And so, the biggest thing that we've thought about as we've gone through this is to say, what are really specific actionable steps that we can take for this? And so in May, in collaboration with the American Public Health Association, we released a guide that really focused on what our local governments on the front lines can do to prepare as they face the overlap of COVID-19 and hurricane activity. And we heard a little bit of this at the very beginning, but just thinking about all of the ways that this makes our response and recovery and our preparation different. So just to give one specific challenge, when you think about communication, usually when there's a hurricane coming, there's one clear message that can come, which is now's the time to evacuate. You might need to go to a shelter. That's so much more difficult to parse now in a COVID-19 environment. first of all, this counters a message we've been saying for 9 months, which is don't leave your home, don't be around other people. So it's much more difficult to get a new message out. Second, we need much more nuanced messaging, because oftentimes there's different messages if you're well, if you might have been exposed to COVID, and if you know you're sick, on where you should go and how you should be exposed to other people. And there's a question of where do you go? These kind of mass congregate shelters that work really well traditionally. Obviously, we're taking a lot of people and putting them together in a shelter without, distancing and things like that isn't the right answer. And so that's really what we focused on. And we've also highlighted a lot of folks who have been doing things that make a lot of sense and are innovative to try to spread that. And a big focus as we've thought about this work is saying, unfortunately, we know from decades of experience that in disasters, the most vulnerable in our communities, disaster scenario, it's incredibly important that we're focused on the most vulnerable members of our community, because we already know that they're at risk when we see a hurricane or flooding, and we have to think about the additional constraints of COVID and make sure that we're really watching out for our entire communities as we see these kind of dual disasters.
All right, so we appreciate that, Melissa. I think there's some information going off in the chat. Folks were mentioning that they weren't able to hear at certain points in the presentation. So it looks like we're having some technical difficulties in terms of the audio, but we will push ahead nonetheless. So question for both of you. I think oftentimes folks have their approach of a watch and see, or a hope and an expectation that dual calamities or disasters don't hit at the same time. But we certainly know that nature will not give us a pardon. What I appreciate about the manual is that it's forward thinking and it's proactive. So what are specific recommendations that you would both have regarding facing a public health crisis in the face of additional natural disasters? So Amanda, we're gonna start with you. Could you give us some specific recommendations?
So I would say you have to really balance what your response measures are for each event, because you don't want to solely focus on the disaster event and then risk having an outbreak in your community 2 weeks later, which would then hinder further recovery efforts. But on the other hand, if you keep people fully separated out to a T to the COVID preparation, ideal COVID, separation, then you might not get your community as prepared before the event as you could be. So I think it's taking lessons learned from both what we have learned already from COVID and what we already know about how to prepare well for natural disasters, and finding that middle ground in between them before the event happens, because we all know, especially in public health and definitely in disasters too, it's better to be proactive than reactive.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that. Melissa, how about you? Any specific recommendations you'd like to share from the guide?
Yeah, I'll focus on 2 areas that I think are important, and hopefully folks can hear me. Let me know if this becomes a problem. I think one is really thinking ahead now about what you want to do with coordinating evacuations while following social distancing guidelines. So think about what your current plan is on the books for evacuation shelters, how many people there, and whether that makes sense. And then think about what you want to do in a COVID environment and what adjustments you want to make. We've seen a lot of examples of people thinking about using hotel rooms, people thinking about setting up multiple smaller shelters. But I'd say the key there is it's so much easier if you do it in advance. You don't want to be scrambling as a storm bears down, trying to negotiate a hotel contract or update all of your procedures or update your signage and your social media for people on where to go. Think ahead now on what you can do. And the other piece that I'll mention that I think is really important is that a lot of the kind of response volunteer support in our communities that comes in after a disaster that's incredibly beautiful that we rely on is, constrained in different ways this year. So we rely on food banks in our community, which have been under enormous strain given the financial downturn and have been doing amazing work, but we can't necessarily rely on them in the same way we typically do before and after a storm. Our volunteers, we have to think about whether we'll be able to get the same volunteer response, because a lot of our wonderful volunteers are older and more at risk. And so we have to think about whether we can rely on that same sort of volunteer response. So I think it's just really thinking all of this out, because doing it a couple weeks before, a flood or a storm is always going to be better than doing it the day of.
That is golden. And I love how you mentioned the volunteers. I did see that in the guide, talking about looking out for things like burnout in your volunteers, recognizing that the first responders too need to be cared for, and not just the folks that have lost in the disasters, but those that are helping. So thank you for bringing that out. So given the fact that COVID-19 has again shown how disasters impact the most vulnerable in our community, both health-wise and socioeconomically, how can we take steps to reduce the impact of our most vulnerable, the impacts that we're having to our most vulnerable within the communities? What types of steps? Let's jump back to Melissa, if you want to take a stab at that. What type of steps can we take?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll answer this in two ways. One is, I think there are some concrete steps we can take, and we've seen some, cities and counties doing a good job we can model. And the other is, we can't forget that, while we have to deal with this tactically right now, this really exposes fault lines in the federal response that we need to deal with, right? Every time we go through a disaster, we shouldn't have to say it's always the most vulnerable that get left behind, they're at risk. We can change these systems so that's not the reality. But I'm really mindful of the fact we're in the middle of hurricane season. We're seeing storms, bear down on us. And so we have to say, what can we do now? So one I'll highlight that I think is a great example of being thoughtful is making sure before a disaster strikes, who's able to actually read and access the communication you're putting out there about what to do in case of a disaster. So one example I'll highlight that we mentioned is Leon County and what they did during Hurricane Irma. They created a really robust multi-pronged approach that involved social media, an app, and physical platforms like bulletin boards and radio. And that's important because I think there's a trend, especially now with physical distancing, to say, just put everything online. But we have to remember that's not accessible to everyone in our community. So we have to be thinking about multi-pronged channels for communications and ways to reach, everyone in our community. So often it's great to partner with community organizations, places of worship, food banks to make sure we're getting the message out to everyone. It's also really important to think about what languages people speak in your community and make sure that messaging is going out in all languages at the same time, because we do sometimes see that, for instance, the messaging in Spanish might go out later because we didn't think of it ahead of time and do the translation ahead of time. That's so important. So we can do that tactically, and then I just leave it on, at the federal level, we have to be thinking about policy solutions that can make this better in the long run. This is something, we've written a lot about in our Turning the Tide series, where we have to think about where does investment go for which communities get flood mitigation, who gets money for preparation, and how do we really change this system so it's a different dynamic.
All right, so that's very important, not just planning ahead, but making sure that the huddle and the discussion is comprehensive, that we have a broad-based representation of different community stakeholders. Love that you mentioned the churches, the universities. That way it's not just assumed that it's government or city hall, but you really have a village approach of everyone banding together to create solutions. So that's wonderful. So as it relates to social equity, what results do we need as we prepare for these dual disasters? What are we failing to build into the system? And that's a question for Melissa.
Oh, yeah. I think at a very high level, what we're failing to build in is kind of metrics and attention to equity. Oftentimes, I would say our response and approach to both pre-disaster mitigation and post-disaster rebuilding and funding can actually worsen inequality, because we've created a system of, federal funding around these issues where it's fractured across over 17 federal agencies. It's really difficult to navigate. I mean, in fact, a lot of people here probably know that in order to be successful, most cities get the recommendation that they should actually hire a grant coordinator or an outside consultant to help them navigate the process. And so, not that those folks aren't wonderful, but what does that mean? It means if you have the financial resources to afford that, you're going to do a lot better in getting federal money. And so money follows money, and our wealthier areas will be able to do more to protect themselves, and our least resourced, most vulnerable areas, which tend to be areas that have been historically marginalized, aren't getting those same resources. And so those fault lines have already existed and kind of been under the surface. And then I think seeing such an active hurricane season along with COVID-19, they've just been even more apparent. But we need to really focus in. And when we do things like fund pre-disaster mitigation or fund rebuilding, it has to be a direct metric to say, what is the effect this is having on social equity? Who's getting funding, not just that funding happened, and who's made better off by this, and who's had a voice in deciding what our communities look like. And as you said, does it really represent the village of folks that live there and are part of the community?
All right, well said. And it's often said in science that you can't measure or you can't monitor what you haven't measured. So important. On Amanda's end, I'm happy that you are on the panel as well for those institutions that are busy collecting data. It's so important for the cities to be in conversation with institutions like Johns Hopkins, like your Florida International Universities and others that are robust data centers. So if we are collecting and we are indeed monitoring, we're able to then measure change and measure progress over time. So an interesting question for Melissa. I know that the American Flood Coalition works with communities across the country, like North Miami, in adapting to issues with flooding and sea level rise. So we've often heard expressions such as, investing in pre-disaster mitigation or building back stronger. Those are common expressions that we hear, and it's easier said than done. So what are some of the biggest obstacles at the state and federal level that you think hinder this type of progress of building back stronger and faster? What are some of the hindrances that you see?
Yeah, that's a great question, because again, I spend my days talking to politicians all over the country, all kind of political persuasions, and very few people tell me that they don't want those things, right? Everyone likes paying lip service to that. And I think our biggest challenge here is just inertia and political will. Making changes, you need political will, and you need people, all of us here, pushing to say this is a priority over the other 30 things that you could be doing with your time and focus and attention. We get the joke a lot because we're the American Flood Coalition, are we for or against flooding, right? There's not a lot of people for flooding, yet we haven't seen any change and we haven't seen progress in decades. So I really think it's inertia. And I think, first of all, we need to overcome that. And then, as I was alluding to before, I think we really need a more nuanced conversation. It's not just more money, but it's how do sources of funding work together so that it's not torturous for our local governments to piece together funding to get projects done? How do we make sure if we do have grant programs that it's not the type of competitive grant program that's a race to the top that leaves a lot of communities behind? So first we have to get the political will, and then we have to have a more nuanced conversation around exactly what we're doing and make sure we're learning from what we've done before that didn't work all that well.
Lovely, lovely. And I appreciate the fact that the American Flood Coalition is nonpartisan. So you have a golden opportunity to definitely engage politicians on both sides, politicians from the federal all the way down to the local level. So we appreciate the engagement that you had here in South Florida. We do know the benefits of that public will, and I think you are suited to be able to engage our public officials and bring them into the conversation. So a question for Amanda, you're not to be left out. So even as we are in the midst of the hurricane season, and it's a high flood prone season, and we're here grappling with COVID-19, it continues to persist. What gives us hope towards the future, Amanda, in a season of bad news with duality of bad news? What gives us hope for the future ahead, Amanda?
So the good news is that we've had so much bad news that we've had a long time to learn about it. So we know so much more about COVID now than we did just 2 months ago. We know how to treat it better. We understand how it spreads. We know how to test for it better and how to prevent the spread of it. Our PPE, our personal protective equipment supplies have gone up. That was a big limiting factor early on. So first responders can be better protected. And we already have all these great resources on how to prevent the worst damage from natural disasters. So now that we have more and more information about COVID, we can start to interweave those two concepts together and really come out of this stronger, both for current, like for right now, and in the future, because this is obviously not going to be the last public health outbreak or emergency during a hurricane season, though hopefully the last big one for a good long while.
Wow, that's well said. I heard a very powerful quote this year. A colleague of mine said that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Crisis is indeed a terrible thing to waste, and you are right, Amanda. There has been a lot of lessons learned this year. I think a lot of best practice guides that have been created this year that will be of benefit for future years or also future generations who may encounter this for years to come. So a question for you again is, what are the differences in the ways that rural communities should respond to hurricanes and a pandemic versus urban areas? So that's a contrast between urban and rural areas. How are they expected to be responding to this duality of crisis? So Amanda, if you want to take a stab at that.
Yeah, so rural communities kind of have a different set of pros and cons from urban communities because they have fewer healthcare resources, like healthcare facilities are often more spread out. They may have fewer healthcare practitioners in the area. And because they're less densely populated, when a disaster hits, the urban centers that are more highly populated are often prioritized first for recovery efforts. Mm-hmm. But in rural areas, you also have a lot of community-led initiatives and a lot more community togetherness and identity and people willing to reach out and help each other. So, and we've been seeing, especially with the Midwestern states that are currently on the rise in terms of COVID cases, it may just be because of that more distributed population that the disease is less visible. Obviously, the wreckage from a hurricane is very visible to everyone, but I think rural communities just really need to redouble down on the messaging of wear your mask, social distance, wash your hands, and keep that ever present when you're responding to a natural disaster, and put money into making sure that your systems are resilient enough to withstand, have enough masks and supplies to go around until more outside help can come in for the disaster recovery process.
Okay, well said. So shifting gears now and looking towards the businesses, I think the discussion oftentimes centers on, the residential centers and on the individuals and human health, but what about the small businesses? What should they keep handy for the hurricane and pandemic season? Melissa, we'll go towards your direction for that one. Talk to us about the small businesses. Any tips there or ideas as to how they can prepare?
Yeah, it's a great question because, even COVID aside, one of the things we see is that after big disasters strike, we see, 40 to 60% of small businesses that have to close their doors never reopen, which just doesn't work, right? And it's because even if aid comes, it comes too late. So I talk about two things for small business owners. First is to really make sure you understand your insurance and what's covered and what's not, especially things like business interruption, whether flooding's covered under your policies, like really making sure that that's something you know. And then the other one is a lesson learned from some unfortunate situations I've seen, which is just make sure the paperwork that you need to apply for an SBA loan, to talk to your insurance, make sure you have it handy and that it's not actually stored someplace that could flood. Because unfortunately we see, you know, some small businesses, it'll flood and all of the paperwork they need to be able to get paid out as a lifeline got flooded and it's really hard to recover. So just make sure that that's on hand and you're not scrambling after a disaster strikes.
The message that I've been hearing interwoven through every question and response is preparation, preparation, and more preparations. Whether you are a homeowner or you're an individual, and certainly if you're a business owner, the message that you should be gleaning from today's presentations, it's important to prepare prior to the disaster. So are there ways that I can mitigate the amount of time that my business must remain closed in response to one of these disasters? How do I mitigate that? There have been a lot of closures this year, quarantine periods. How do I mitigate that? Either ladies, if you want to take that, Amanda or Melissa. Business closure.
Sure, I can take a stab at it first. So you obviously can't control how long your business will have to remain shut down if there's a state or local government order to remain shut down in the interest of public health. But during that time, I would say, take time to identify what are your limiting factors to reopening. Is your business space small and that's limiting your ability to open up to multiple customers? Maybe see if you can look into outdoor service. Is PPE supply something difficult? Maybe look into, storing up masks and gloves for your employees so that everyone feels safe when they return to the business. Because I think that was something that caught us off guard in April and May, was that we just hadn't had to do this at this scale before. And now people generally know what they need to be preparing so that next time it's shorter and a smaller impact.
All right, Melissa, you are nodding. Is there anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, the only piece that I would add, especially on the disaster side, is just that, the longer it takes after a disaster strikes to kind of gather all the information and get your paperwork together and submit, the longer it's going to be until you might get like the loan or the insurance payout you need to be able to get back on your feet. So the more you can have ready ahead of time and know kind of what your plan would be, the better it is. And unfortunately, what happens after disaster strikes is a lot of people are in the same boat. So if you have stuff ready and can submit it, early, it's going to be better. So that would definitely be my advice.
Right, golden advice there. And the final question that I wanted to pose to both of you, are there things, practical things that community officials, local officials can implement to safeguard constituents from these disasters? What are things on the local government side that you'd like to recommend that we should be doing to help to safeguard or mitigate our constituents from these disasters? Melissa, let's start with you.
Yeah, first, people can imagine I'm probably going to say think about and plan for the dual disaster scenario. Take a look at some of the guidance we've put out and others that have specific recommendations about things like communication, sheltering, getting reimbursement after the disaster from the federal government, all really important things. And then I would say on a broader point, our local governments make a huge difference and have, control over a lot of policy and infrastructure investment that can protect us, right? We know that, storms are getting stronger. We have increasing sea level rise with more frequent flooding, but that doesn't mean that there aren't actions we can take that make our communities a lot safer, from things like making sure people have accurate information, making sure our policies and zoning is keeping up with this new reality, investing in the type of infrastructure that can keep communities safe, and just making sure that our water, stormwater, and drainage infrastructure is kind of up to the job. We see a lot of places where pipes might not have been replaced in 80 years, and that makes it really hard to deal with kind of increasing flooding and increasing challenges. So there's a lot that your local government can be doing to make this more manageable. And my last plug is that some of those actions can actually lower your flood insurance costs through the CRS program.
Absolutely true. That was a great plug. There's actually a discount, you're right, for your flood insurance. The CRS for the cities. So being on the city end, I can definitely attest to the need to communicate with the constituents to understand the needs. I can't emphasize enough the importance of having surveys. Oftentimes cities may implement programs with the assumption that the need is there in the community when they haven't polled the community or asked the community, what are your needs? So something as basic as having surveys done prior to the disasters to understand what the flood issues are and what the needs are could help to mitigate some of these issues when they do occur. So we've come to the end of our questions. I don't know if we have actual time for Q&A. Rachel, if you want to give us some guidance on that, are you taking questions and answers depending on your time slot? And you are double muted.
Again, with the double mute. Sorry about that. I don't see any questions in the Q&A box right now, but if any of the participants would like to ask a question, you can do that through the function on Zoom, and we'll give it just a minute to see if any of those questions do come through.
So I'll throw a question in the hopper while you're waiting on a question to pop in. Local governments have always had a challenge with having more need than money. So I noticed your guide is really amazing. I really want to put a plug in for the guide. If you could put the web address maybe in the chat for those that would want to check out the guide. I was very impressed with it. There's a section of your guide that actually has resource information on grants. It's like an entire page of grant information that local governments can access and take a look at. So how do you find additional resources to prepare and to help to prepare your constituents in a disaster, dual disaster type of situation? Where do you go as local governments who are strapped with funding and looking for additional resources?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question, and thank you for saying that. To say that these aren't easy choices now, they've never been, and they're getting harder to say there's all these things we have to do, but it all costs money and involves trade-offs. I think the number one thing I would say is if you're going to read nothing else, make sure to take a look at the section of the guide that talks about how to get full reimbursement for your disaster response, because there are things you need to do around making sure you're tracking the right things. Part of the response involves tracking in-kind volunteer labor to make sure that you're putting that against the federal match. And I always like to say, like, that might look different now, right? You might have a system to track people who show up after a disaster and literally, pick up pieces of trees. But if your volunteers are virtual now, do you have a system to track that and make sure that you're getting credit? I think that's really important. And then I would say, think about now's a good time to maximize grants, especially ones that don't have cost shares. And this is something, we've just put out a flood funding finder on to really help make that accessible, especially for small communities, because we know this is a real challenge.
Wonderful. Thank you for that feedback. And I know a lot of people were taking notes regarding the web link and where they can access that information. Certainly, we don't want to leave any money on the table where the reimbursements are concerned. So I do agree with you. If you read nothing else in the guide, definitely put a placeholder on that section. Very informative, and I think it can add a lot of value to the cities that are looking for greater resources. So with that, I thank you for a very spirited discussion, very informative. I hope that folks were able to glean some very pertinent information from today's discussion. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Tanya and to our panelists and to Deputy Director Guthrie, who had joined us earlier. We want to thank you all for attending today's webinar. We will send all of the links that were shared and any other background information in a follow-up email to all of the registered attendees to the webinar. And if you'd like to get additional updates on this or any other related topic that Science is Us is working on, you can sign up for that information on our website, which is scienceisus.org. And with that, I'd like to thank you all again for attending, and another thank you to our panelists and our wonderful moderator. And that concludes today's webinar. Thank you.